right, so it is 9:01. I'm sure people are going to continue to join, I hope. But for those of you that are here, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So good morning, and thank you all for being here for the first webinar of our 2021 Forestry webinar series presented by the Sustainable Forests Education Co-op in collaboration with the University of Minnesota Extension. So I'm Caitlin Wilson. I'm sure a lot of you have seen me at least over Zoom by now. I'm the education program specialist at SFEC, and I'm really excited. We have a great lineup this year. I'm glad to be finally kicking it off today. And so I'm sure most of you are aware, just based on the emails and all that, but just as a reminder, if you've registered to be here today, you have access to the entire 2021 webinar series. So this is different from in the past where we did month to month. Individual registrations, it's kind of more of a subscription now. So if you've registered and you're here today, you will receive connection instructions every month to the webinar, to your inbox. In addition to getting those instructions there, you can also access the connection instructions on Canvas here. So we've got a Canvas event page or web page set up. So if you go to that link and log in, you'll be able to access the Zoom link each month. So I'll update that every month. And this is great because I know some people have some issues with MailChimp sending the instructions to their spam, or it's the morning of and you just can't seem to find those instructions in your inbox. For the life of you, you can now bookmark this page. You can log in using your University of Minnesota guest account information and just access the Zoom link from there every month. So hopefully that'll make it easier for some of you. And also in an attempt to try something new, I've asked everyone who registered about their continuing ed credit requests during registration. So if you answered those questions and telling me your membership type and which credits you'd like to request, I'll process your credit for you for every webinar that you attend. If you can't remember if you filled that out or not, or you're feeling unsure, we're still going to drop the link at the end of the webinar, like we always have with the Google form. You'll also be automatically redirected to that request form when you close the webinar window. So again, because it's a little different this year, and that by registering for one webinar, you have access to the entire series, you actually are only going to need to request your continuing ed credits once. So unless something changes, such as the credit type you're requesting or the email address you're using, you only need to do that once. If you do it multiple times, it won't hurt. But if you forget and you attend a webinar, I will see you in the attendance and I will know that you've previously requested it for this year, and I'll be able to process your credits for you. As always, we are recording this webinar and it'll be posted to our website sometime tomorrow. You'll be notified by email when the recording is available. And without further ado, I'm pleased to be able to welcome Matt Russell this morning. Matt is an associate professor and extension specialist with the University of Minnesota's Department of Forest Resources. And Matt's going to be talking today about carbon as a forest product and how it's continued to gain traction over the last year. And as a result, we've seen a number of emerging markets that seek to pay landowners for carbon in their trees. So he's going to provide several tips and resources for foresters and other natural resource professionals for integrating forest carbon into their work. Matt has said that he does have a lot of resources and links throughout his presentation. So here's the link in the chat now to his slide deck. You can just copy and paste that into your browser window and feel free to follow along. Post questions to the chat as they come, and we will answer those at the end. And without dragging this on any longer, Matt, the screen is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Caitlin. Thanks, Caitlin, for moderating today. It's really great to be a part of this webinar series, and I appreciate all of you attending at our new time here first thing and in the morning. So happy to be here. Like Caitlin said, I want to talk today about carbon. And now what I have seen, and I know I've talked with Eli and others, just the need for more discussions and more of the basics when it comes to talking about carbon. We all hear a lot about carbon markets, about landowners being able to get paid for just growing their trees. But I think there's a lot of nuance and a lot of information and data that's behind carbon, how carbon markets operate, how landowners get paid, how we quantify how much carbon are in forests. That really needs discussion. And so this was really a fun slide deck to put together. It kind of encompasses a lot of research and teaching that I've done in the past several years, and I hope you find it the same way. And so with that, a little bit of a roadmap for where we're going this morning. I'm going to do a little bit of Carbon 101 to talk about forests as what we call natural climate solutions. And then I'll then talk about sequestration and storage, the differences between those. So much of what's going on with forest carbon is driven by markets and driven by policies. So I'll spend just a little bit of time on that. I want to clarify, I am not a policy expert. I am not one that knows all the intricacies of all the policies, but whenever you're talking about carbon in 2021, it's essential to know what's driving carbon assessments. And then I want to talk about carbon at the tree stand and landscape scales. How do we quantify carbon? What are some ways that we might better understand carbon values? And then I'll talk about some opportunities that we might see with the forest carbon world in 2021 and beyond. And so with that, just like this Dilbert cartoon shows the value of trees, everyone, even outside the forestry profession, has understood the value of trees as natural climate solutions. And so we all know that trees are good for the environment because they take in carbon dioxide from the air and turn it into carbon. And so that's a valuable thing that trees provide. When we talk about all of the good things that trees and forests provide, from clean air, clean water, recreation, increasingly we're adding carbon and carbon sequestration to that mix. And so it's really important and for us to convey that just the value of trees, for carbon sequestration, for wood products, there's a lot of different applications of trees and forests to our battle against climate change in the natural climate solution space. I really like this graph by the US Forest Service that talks about the different boom and bust cycles of forest carbon. And so certainly carbon sequester and they store, forests sequester and store carbon through growth, but it's also released. And so as an example, all of the major wildfires that happened in the western states this last summer, all of that carbon that was residing in those trees has been released. And that was really an immediate release to the atmosphere. But also we have deadwood in forests. As that deadwood decays, it's slowly releasing carbon back to the atmosphere through decomposition of dead trees. And then eventually we have regrowth, planting new trees, carbon sequestration, we get regrowth after, say, a major disturbance. And we often see the carbon that's found in the trees, that is in the stems of trees, in the foliage and the branches, but there's a tremendous amount that happens below ground. A lot of carbon is stored in soil, especially in our peatland systems in Minnesota. A lot of carbon is stored in the roots, and also other areas across the forest floor, whether it's the litter pool or whether that organic soil pool. Trees and the boles of trees are really just one spot, one carbon pool where carbon resides in a forest. And so with that, this is basically why carbon happens. And so all we need is a little bit of CO2, a little bit of water, and we get basically glucose and oxygen. And all that is through the magic of photosynthesis. And so if you remember back to your, I don't know if they teach us in 5th grade, photosynthesis and what plants do and this formula. But this is basically the process that we're spending so much time talking about when we talk about carbon sequestration, just the process of trees using photosynthesis to basically build carbon in wood. And so if you took a forestry class, when you kind of talked about the measurement side or the mensuration side, you probably had a couple of weeks where you might have talked about growth and yield. And so growth and yield being, we want to predict how our trees might grow, how much volume our trees might have. When you did that, you always talked about growth kind of in a volume context. And so if we have a certain set of stand conditions today, what might it look like tomorrow or 50 years from now? And so you might use a growth model. Well, when we talk about growth, that's really what sequestration is. It's just the process by which trees and plants use CO2 and photosynthesis to store carbon as plant biomass. And so whenever we talk about sequestration, we always have to have a time 1 and a time 2, so that we know and we can quantify how much carbon is being sequestered over a certain time period. Generally, in Minnesota and in other forests, carbon sequestration decreases as trees age. Now that's a general assumption. So these are some numbers from FIA, a validator. And so this is a program where you can go in and do quick summaries of some of the FIA data that are being collected across about 6,000 plots across the state of Minnesota. And so when we look at the validator data, we look at if a stand is 10 years old, it can sequester about 0.6 tons of carbon per acre per year. 50 years old, about 0.2 tons per acre per year, and 100 years old, about 0.15 tons of carbon per acre per year. And so this is all forest types, all stand conditions. It's a very general assumption, but generally carbon sequestration, just like people grow less as they age, the forests and trees do the same thing. Now, carbon storage, on the other hand, is how much yield you get. And so if back in your forest measurements class, you talked about growth and yield, well, the carbon storage is what you get after carbon sequestration happens. And so at any point in time, you can measure a forest and find out what the carbon storage is. And we think about that as just the current amount of carbon that's found in a tree or woodland. And we call that carbon storage. These are some data from the most recent forest inventory and analysis program summaries of some of the national greenhouse gas inventories on the role that forests play. If we look at Minnesota, we sequester, or we average about 75 US tons of carbon per acre. And so 1 ton being equal to 2,000 pounds. And so you can look at the graph here across the different pools that we have. By far, the mineral soil is the largest contributor. That's where most of the carbon is actually stored in our forests, particularly in certain ecosystems in the state. Behind that, the above ground biomass. And so this is what we might think of as including the merchantable trees, the tops and limbs and foliage of a tree. The organic soil comes in third, and then litter, deadwood, and below ground biomass kind of round out the last couple of carbon pools across our forests. And so when we look at different states, this is just Minnesota, we look at different states, it's generally the same ranking, that is soils followed by above ground biomass and trees. There can be some differences. For example, in the western states, there may be a lot of deadwood if they've had some of those more recent disturbances such as wildfire. And so with that, these rankings of kind of which pools contribute the most to carbon become important, especially as you can look at the transition. So as you go from a major disturbance happening, well, that might take away some carbon to the above ground biomass pool, but then automatically put it into the deadwood pool and maybe the litter pool, depending on if that biomass has broken up at all and is now on the forest floor. And so it's important to understand that while we often see just the trees, there's more carbon actually residing in some of these other pools across the forest. I do want to point out this is a great resource that I worked with the Forest Resources Association on. These are the forest carbon reports that we made for every state. And so you're looking at Minnesota here, and there's a link there that you can click on to learn more information. And so these forest carbon reports kind of look at the trends going back to 1990. And 1990 is a really common year. You'll see a lot of forest carbon literature going back to that date, because that falls in line with a lot of the international agreements like the Kyoto Protocol that were established relating carbon and climate change. And so a lot of the things you'll see go back to 1990. And so every one of these graphs shows kind of the trends, how much carbon is stored across Minnesota ownerships, the carbon pools in Minnesota forests, and then a graph of the storage and sequestration, and along with some other quick facts about what's the contribution of forests and forest carbon in that state. So I really encourage you to take a look at that resource if you find value to it. Now I want to transition a bit to kind of talking about policy and what that means for some of the forest carbon markets that are available. If you haven't had the chance yet, and I know we have, I guess, just one more day until a transition in our federal government, but there is a great document called the Climate 21 Project. And this is a transition memo written specifically for the Department of Agriculture. by a number of people that were interested in kind of looking at working with the transition team and looking at what that means. And so there are lots of recommendations in there that have a direct implication to how we manage our forests. One of them is establishing a carbon bank. And so this is something that could be funded through the federal government through some existing opportunities that would provide incentives for landowners to manage carbon. It also mentions the importance of collecting and analyzing data on forest carbon. It talks about establishing a wildfire commission, expanding rural development programs that could impact some of the forest landowners. It talks about increasing funding for USDA climate science research. It talks about funding climate smart land management practices. So I really encourage you. I think this document does a great summary of kind of the federal government and where we're transitioning as we talk about more of a role of carbon as it relates to climate change that's been a part of many policy initiatives that have been outlined thus far. With that, that Climate 21 document does a great job of talking about the role that markets might play in how forests are managed for carbon. And so one of those kinds of markets is what we might call a regulatory carbon market. And so this is also synonymous with the cap and trade system. And so I'll talk about the example from California and how that's operated in the next slide. But in here, basically the emitter will purchase, the emitter being, say, some factory, some power plant. The emitter purchases an amount of annual emissions, or what they call a cap. If they release below that cap, well, they can sell those remaining allowances to other emitters. Or if they release above the cap, they must purchase allowances. And so that's where this idea of forests and the role that carbon offset credits play. And so we're basically trading different amounts of carbon that are out there. And so those different amounts that are carbon, that allowance is really set by regulation. And so that's how forests play a role, is that they're basically the object doing the work in this greenhouse gas regulatory carbon market system. And so the best example of that is what's going on in California and has gone since at least a decade now. And so the California Compliance Offset Program was required by regulation. So this is Bill 32 from several years ago. So it asked California to return to 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions by 2020. And actually they did that. They actually did it by 2016. And so they met their goal, and then they're going to continue doing this program well into the future. And so you can enroll forest offset projects by enrolling a forest property into this California system. And so the good thing is that it's not just California landowners and California properties that go into this, but it's from all over the United States. Most of them, I think, are from Alaska. Most of the project acreages are from Alaska in this California market. But you can see there are projects across the entire United States. And so that's a benefit. And so if forests are sequestering carbon elsewhere, well, they can be traded and as a part of this California market system. And so this has generally been a good success because it's been a part of lowering greenhouse gas emissions in California and meeting that goal to decrease those levels before 2020. Now, the downside of that, this is a great paper that talks about some of the intricacies with the California system. The downside of that is that just the incredible numbers of acres that are typically a part of this system. And so on average, for the improved forest management track, so you can choose kind of, are you going to manage your forests to improve forest management, or are you going to manage forests to avoid conversion? And so for the most common tract, the average size of the property is almost 50,000 acres. And so you might expect that might work well for maybe, in Minnesota and the Lake States, maybe some of our more industrial landowners, but it's not going to work for most of the people that have, 40 acres, 60 acres near the cabin. And so it's not a system designed for smaller landowners and those landowners with smaller properties. And so you can see that the size of the properties are quite large, almost 50,000 acres, and they're really widely dispersed. And so most of the acreages are not in California, so they're spread across the entire country. And so this makes a regulatory carbon market tough to enter for a small landowner. So that's where voluntary carbon markets come in. These voluntary carbon markets have really exploded in the last several years, and they're typically offered by private entities, sometimes backed by private monies from companies. Many of them are designed for smaller property sizes and also shorter time commitments. And so many of the regulatory markets are longer terms, 50 years, 100 years, to allow your storage and your sequestration to happen in forests. But many of these voluntary markets are even as short as 1 year. And so a tremendous difference compared to some of the markets we just talked about. And so when you think about these, when you think about that landowner with 40, 60 acres, these actually may be some of the greatest opportunities for private woodland owners with smaller properties by entering a voluntary carbon market system. To give you a sense about how much they've grown in the last several years, this is a graph showing that growth. What you can see in the bar charts is the amount of carbon that's been sold through voluntary carbon markets since 2005. The line graph in red shows the cumulative volume of everything. And so what you can see here is there was some more diversity in terms of the carbon markets along the late 2000s. This was when the Chicago Climate Exchange was operating. It's no longer operating because the markets were pretty inactive by about 2011, 2012. There wasn't a lot of energy, and so that exchange closed. But what you can see now is, especially since 2017, we've seen an incredible growth, kind of back to almost some of what the levels were when the Chicago Climate Exchange existed in the voluntary carbon markets. And so this is a great showing of just how in the last 2-3 years, those voluntary carbon offsets have really grown again. So it seems like I don't go by a week or every few days I see something either through my email inbox or through social media about a new carbon market that's out there, and it's typically one of these voluntary ones. And so the American Forestry Foundation has a great one for family forest carbon that's really targeted to small landowners. Other companies such as Finite Carbon, Sylvia Terra, Forest Carbon Works have their own, and many of them are really specifically targeting smaller woodland owners. And a lot of them now, if you look at these websites, they're kind of in pilot mode, or maybe they're just starting to expand to larger areas. And so I think the best way to keep in touch with these is just to sign up for their email lists, see where they're at. It's really tough to, what we've been telling landowners with 40, 60 acres is that it's not really quite there yet in Minnesota to enter one of these voluntary carbon markets. But if they ask us in a year or maybe 18 months, there's probably going to be some system that exists that's going to be really easy for landowners to access some of these carbon markets. With that, I think I'll take a pause and maybe just check in with Caitlin to see if we have any immediate questions so far.
Matt, yeah, we've got a few questions if you want to take them now, or at least a couple of them. Tony Miller asked, why does mineral soil hold more carbon than organic soil?
Yeah, good question. It's an incredible pool, particularly, if we look at some of our ecosystems in Minnesota, like the peatlands, black spruce, tamarack bogs. There's just an incredible pool. They are expansive. They are slow to decompose, so just a large pool compared to the trees that we've got growing above them.
Oh, I muted myself. How does the sequestration rate vary by tree species? I've read papers that show that individual white pine, red pine, and white spruce can continue to grow relatively rapidly, even at older ages.
Yeah, so sequestration rates are really tied with shade tolerance in a lot of ways. And so that's a generalization, but most of our pioneer species are species that come right after disturbances, species like aspen, species like cherry, even some of the jack pine species. many of them have a kind of grow fast and die policy. And so growing fast means sequestering more carbon, whereas some of the maples, some of the oaks, some of the more shade tolerant species, they have kind of a grow slow. And so their sequestration rates are going to be slower over time compared to those pioneer species. So definitely when you think about sequestration rates, think about how shade tolerant the species is. Often the two are tied together.
All right, we've got 3 more here. You want to take them now?
Sure. Yeah, let's take them now, and then I'll talk more about quantifying forest carbon.
Great. So there have been recent studies that suggest that sequestration increases in mature forests. Muma and Tollefson, for example, is there room to question old-style forestry assumptions about sequestration in old-growth forests beyond the report in the Daily Mining Gazette?
It's a good point. There are studies that can show that even some of our older species can respond to management. That is, we can thin. There's a Canadian paper that shows we can thin like 150-year-old white pine and still get a response, and that will increase the sequestration rate for these really old trees. So there is some evidence there. Generally, it depends on what's replacing the trees that die. And so if that forest is healthy and it's still going to have growing trees beneath, say, if we have an aspen stand that's growing, as long as there's something there to replace those trees that eventually will senesce, you can hold that sequestration rate. Generally, what we do in forestry is we typically look at age and how well that predicts, but the sequestration concepts don't apply as well when we're dealing with mixed ages, when we're dealing with mixed species. It just gets a little bit more complex to quantify how our forests are sequestering carbon.
All right. Does an acre of dominant buckthorn store as much carbon as an acre of hardwoods without any buckthorn? And does an acre of dominant buckthorn sequester as much carbon in the first 10 years as the growth of an acre of hardwoods without buckthorn?
That's a great, gosh, I hope not to make that link for managing for invasive species for carbon. But yeah, initially, I don't doubt that, you could get some pretty good sequestration rates with buckthorn invading an area. But I mean, we certainly know that the problems of buckthorn outcompeting native species, degrading habitat, will really degrade that. But we'll see when I talk about quantifying forest carbon. Shrubs really don't contribute all that much. If you have a 20-inch white pine tree in that and you have buckthorn underneath it, odds are that 20-inch white pine tree is going to weigh probably just as much or more than all the buckthorn across that acreage. Just because shrubs like buckthorn don't necessarily grow to be all that large compared to if you have just a couple of big trees in a forest.
Okay. Last one for now. How does the cap and trade model account for carbon released by massive wildfires? Are the participants in the cap and trade plan expected to bear the costs of natural carbon releases from wildfire?
That's a great question. And generally, there is some allocations there and some recognition that disturbances happen. Most of the time, these landowners are putting in excess of 50,000 acres at a time, and so that's incorporated into the cap and trade markets. Specifically, how it's done, I'm not exactly sure.
Okay, that's it for now, Matt.
Great. Well, thanks for those great questions. Going to switch gears a bit and talk about how we quantify forest carbon. And so if you're like me, you maybe have seen, if you look at some of the things that come across your email inbox or start to read reports, you might see units like pounds and kilograms and tons and megagrams and metric tons, and then there's tons, and then there's tons with 2 N's and spelled a little bit differently. What's the difference there? And even I, in this presentation, have talked about different units. I've talked about carbon, I've talked about carbon dioxide, I've talked about CO2 equivalent. And so if you're like me, you really don't know how to make sense of any of this. And so there are lots of units, there are lots of different ways to quantify how much carbon we have. How might we kind of weed through that and think about what it actually means in terms of what we might know already about our forests and how we quantify them. And so this is this is an ash tree. And so say it's about a 20-inch diameter ash tree. And so the thing to remember is that carbon is just weight. And so if we can figure out the mass of a tree, we can find out how much carbon is in it. And so the green weight of this tree, this 20-inch tree, is about 6,000 pounds. So if it were cut down, if we were to weigh this tree on the stump, it'd be about a 6,000 pound tree. Now the dry weight of it, if we were to dry this out, say in a kiln, it'd be about 50% water, so it'd weigh about 3,000 pounds. Now with wood, half of the biomass of wood is carbon. And so 1,500 pounds is the result. So the amount of carbon in this ash tree is about 1,500 pounds, or about a quarter of the entire weight of the tree. And so when we talk about carbon, well, that's how much carbon, that's the weight of the tree. But we can think about what's the equivalent of that in CO2 that it's captured from the atmosphere. And so there's a conversion for that. 1 unit of carbon is about 3.6 units of CO2 equivalent. And so this represents about 5,500 pounds of CO2 equivalent that's been sequestered in that tree. And so this is a typical way that we use to eventually find out, well, how much carbon is, say, stored across the United States in our trees. So this goes back to the question about shade tolerance and about carbon sequestration, but species contain different amounts of carbon. And so this really depends on their size. Certainly the larger the tree, the taller, the bigger, the more carbon it will have. It depends on the specific gravity. So what about the specific nature of the wood properties? And it depends on the bark ratio. So you can see in this graph, this is a classical paper in the forest measurements community that looks at quantifying the carbon and really the biomass. If we know biomass, we know what carbon is of different species. And so for these 8 or so different species groups, we can see that the maples, oaks, and hickories have the largest diameters or have the most carbon for a specified diameter. And so compare that to our cedar and larch trees, which have generally the lowest amount of biomass, the lowest amount of carbon for the same diameter tree, if we were to compare that to, say, a maple or an oak or a hickory tree. And so it's important to understand what the species are when it comes to quantifying how carbon is different across different species, different forests. I do want to take a sidetrack now and just tell a little bit of a story. When the quarantine began, this was kind of, as you all remember, back in March, April of last spring, many of us in Extension were moving around and trying to figure out what can we get landowners to do because we weren't doing in-person workshops. And so one of the things we had started was the Tree and Woodland Carbon Capture Challenge. And so the idea here was to find the tree in Minnesota that sequesters the most carbon. And so this was a great event. Many people sent in their photos, sent in what they did, and they sent their measurements of their tree. And so the idea was they measured their tree in April, right at the start of the growing season, and we just had them measure the diameter of the tree, and we used some of those equations to figure out how much carbon they stored. And then they measured the same trees at the end of the growing season in October to figure out how much they sequestered. And so we did all the math on the back end. They made the measurements, the diameter measurements, and then we calculated how much carbon they had. And so this was a great event that got people out there recognizing the value of carbon, understanding how tree size relates to carbon, and then we tallied the result. And so I just want to show one example tree that we did. And so this was a silver maple in Ramsey County. So in April, it was about 10.4 inches in diameter breast height. When it was remeasured again in October, it was about 11.3 inches in diameter breast height. So that's a pretty good growth for, and this was a yard tree, that's a pretty good growth for a silver maple. And so good growth on that tree. So we can then calculate by the end of the growing season, the tree now stores 518 pounds of carbon, and it sequestered about 97 pounds of carbon just through that growing season. And so this would be the equivalent of about 356 CO2 equivalents if we were to kind of measure that in terms of how much it stores or it's sequestered through the atmosphere. And so this is a good example of just showing the value of carbon sequestration as it relates to some of the measurements that folks took. One of the great things, especially for those of you that are involved in public outreach and describing the work that you do to others, the Environmental Protection Agency has a greenhouse gas equivalency calculator. And so this is a really great tool to show what is the equivalent in, say, your tree or your forest relating to things that people understand more clearly, like how many passenger vehicles driven in a year, how many gallons of gas consumed. And so these are the results for that silver maple in Ramsey County from the Carbon Challenge. And so what you're seeing here is that the amount that was sequestered in that silver maple in the 2020 growing season was equivalent to about 0.035 passenger vehicles driven for 1 year. Or that's equivalent from the CO2 emissions from about 18.2 gallons of gas consumed. So I don't know, like in your personal vehicle, how much your tank size is in your gas tank. Mine's about 18 gallons. And so about 1 tank of gas is the equivalent of what that tree sequestered last year in Ramsey County in that silver maple. And so there's lots of other great resources and great equivalency measurements that you can tell others when it comes to conveying how much or how important your forest and sequestration really is. And so that's really kind of at the tree level. If we want to go to a stand level, we need to basically scale up the measurements we make on trees to a per acre basis. And when we do this, we typically talk about tons per acre or the metric equivalent megagrams per hectare. And so 1 US ton is 2,000 pounds. 1 megagram is the same as a metric ton, and it's just a little more, about 1.1 US tons. And then 1 ton per acre, we have an equivalency thing for that if we want to calculate how many megagrams per hectare it is. And I mentioned the metric measurements here because they are important, especially when we go to some of these voluntary carbon markets, especially at the international level. Most of the international accounting of carbon is done in metric units. And so even though we all measure, at least in the US Forest Service and in the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, we tend to measure things on English units, thinking about feet and thinking about cords and board feet. At the international level, when we talk about carbon, we have to submit to using the metric system because everyone else uses it. So this is just an example of some data I put together looking at carbon storage in aspen birch forests across Minnesota. I can't remember how many specific forest inventory and analysis plots there are in the state in aspen birch, but it's probably around 1,000 or 1,500. And so this looks at looking at stand age and carbon storage in US tons per acre. And so you can see that you very quickly can increase the storage capacity in aspen and birch stands, but eventually you kind of reach an asymptote. That is, we don't have, aspen is a short-lived species, so we don't have a ton of data points that are, say, over 80 years old in some of our aspen forests. And so what about carbon sequestration? And so this is a graph of those same FIA plots looking at carbon sequestration in aspen and birch forests. And very similarly, you can see a lot of sequestration happening early on when stands are developing, but as you go through, they end up becoming a source because they eventually end up kind of falling apart unless there are trees there to replace the dying aspen. And so whenever we have sequestration happening, we have what we call a sink. That is, the forests are sinks of carbon. They're sequestering more carbon than they are putting into the atmosphere. However, if you start to have more mortality, more death, more decomposition, those forests can transition to being a source of carbon. That is to say, the growth of the trees doesn't equal the amount that they're the amount of mortality and the amount that they're decomposing. So I think it's important to understand at the stand level how we use individual trees to kind of scale up and to represent what's happening, say, on a per acre basis. I've also done some analyses kind of looking at, well, we typically still inventory our forests on cords and boards. That is to say, if we look at a timber sale agreement, we're likely to see cords per acre and board feet per acre listed as the unit. And so we need to do a lot of work to kind of convert that measure of volume to a measure of weight or a measure of carbon. And so these are some analyses I've put together, kind of looking at, well, if you know what the cords per acre are or the board feet per acre, well, you can calculate how much carbon you've got based on some statistical models that we develop. And so as an example, so here's a typical Minnesota DNR timber sale. So we want to find out how much carbon is in this tract of land. There's nothing really special. This is kind of a run-of-the-mill timber sale. And so we've got 62 acres. This is in Pine County, measured out of the Sandstone area office. This is public data, nothing fancy here. We've got about 1,065 cords of aspen for sale and about 43 cords, just a little bit of paper birch for sale. So we want to calculate how much carbon. So we've got the volume in cords, but how much carbon is there? Well, we can use some of those statistical models to say, well, we know if we've got 62 acres, and we've got about just over 1,000 cords, we've got 17.2 cords per acre. That's pretty run-of-the-mill and an aspen stand, maybe on the lower side of what we might harvest. Well, we know that that's about 13.2 metric tons of carbon per acre. And so now that's just in the live trees. And so that's just kind of taking the merchantable volume here that we've got from our timber sale and calculating how much carbon is found in there. And so a good way to kind of think about transitioning from a volume estimate to a carbon estimate. This is just another graph showing just some data put together at the Cloquet Forestry Center in their last permanent sample plot inventory. There's about 92 aspen plots, about 102 red pine plots, just showing the distribution of carbon across Cloquet. So these are distribution plots showing an aspen. Well, it looks like the majority of them are somewhere around kind of that 20 metric tons of carbon per acre. There's a couple that have kind of some more volume there. With red pine, we have more carbon storage, about 60 metric tons per acre of carbon in red pine across the live trees there. So just some example applications of how we might think about using some volume data, the kind of data we already collect as a part of all of our forest inventories, and calculating that to a carbon or a carbon per unit area basis. So as a part of that carbon capture challenge I mentioned earlier, we also had a few people that actually did woodlands. Now, when I say they did woodlands, they basically went through and did a 10th acre plot. And so they stood in one spot and counted all the trees about 26 feet away from them. And that was their measurement plot. So kind of typical what people do in timber cruising all the time. And so we calculated, you can see there were 5 people that submitted responses for that. We calculated the carbon stored in their woods on a tons per acre basis. And then we calculated the carbon sequestered through the 2020 growing season. And so the winner, just to give you some context for numbers here, Team Trillium was a family in just outside Bemidji, Minnesota, and their carbon measured about 37 tons per acre. It sequestered just over 1 ton per acre just in that growing season, 1.3 tons per acre in the 2020 growing season. And that was a pretty diverse stand. So they had measurements. They measured quaking aspen, basswood, bur oak, and sugar maple. You see some of the other tree species that are there. The lowest measured was 0.35 tons per acre of carbon sequestered. And so just to give you some context, as you start hearing more about these numbers in terms of how much carbon can Minnesota forest sequester, these kinds of numbers might be helpful to put everything else in context. So this is just a graph showing, just like we did for the single tree, this is for the woodland on a per acre basis. So on a woodland on a per acre basis, that woodland in Bemidji that had all those different tree species, well, it offset the equivalent of almost 500 gallons of gas consumed just on 1 acre in that woodland outside Bemidji. So again, can't say enough about this great tool that the EPA has about the greenhouse gas equivalencies. just chatting a little bit more about, at the national level, how are our carbon stocks doing? And so this is a graph that looks at some of the recent FIA data that they've compiled for each of the different states and quantifies how much carbon has moved in the last almost 3 decades. And so on the whole, we have more carbon in our forests than we did in 1990, about 11% more, but that depends on the state that you're in. So you can see that most of the biggest gains in forest carbon stocks have been in the Southeast. And so Mississippi, Virginia, Alabama, Florida, Arkansas, well, that's where trees grow faster. And that's where trees sequester more carbon just because of longer growing seasons, better growing conditions in many cases. And so there's a lot of sequestration happening in that part of the region. There are some states that actually lost carbon, and most of those are going to be found in the Mountain West areas. So the Mountain West has seen a lot of wildfires. They've seen a lot of mountain pine beetle outbreaks, a lot of other forest health challenges that have actually lessened the number of carbon or the amount of carbon. So think about Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah. Many of these states have seen losses in forest carbon across the last 3 decades. So when we talk about, like I said earlier, when we talk about carbon at a national scale or even at an international scale, we have to start using metric tons, just because that's what's being used across many different agencies, many different players that are looking at carbon across the nation, across the US. And so on the whole, this number changes a little bit every year across the US. Forests, urban trees, harvested wood products remove about 14% of all the CO2 emissions that happen in the country in that year. And so that varies, especially by state. A lot of states that have lots of manufacturing, say a state like Michigan, that number is a bit lower, just because the more manufacturing, it means more work that forests have to do in that state to sequester emissions from those factories. So I want to kind of wrap up and kind of bring things home just by talking about some of the opportunities that might be available related to forest carbon. And this is really kind of from now and beyond as we begin to learn more about forest carbon opportunities. The first thing is I think with the voluntary carbon markets now coming on board, they are really going to motivate smaller landowners to manage forests for carbon. And I think that as professionals, we need to be well suited and we need to be ready to help answer questions, to help landowners get involved in these markets. Just like landowners are interested in, maybe a state cost share program or a tax incentive program, we're going to need resources, we're going to need capacity to really be able to help landowners to enter these markets and to kind of help them cut through, how much carbon are my forests storing? How much do they sequester? We're going to need to be prepared to help landowners through that. So that's going to be a great opportunity for landowners and for some of these voluntary carbon markets, especially in Minnesota. There's a lot of a kind of turn to national focus on climate change, and this can really promote forest carbon research. And so it seems like whenever we talk about climate change in forests, adjacent to that, we're talking about forest carbon. We're talking about carbon sequestration. And so this really comes through in that Climate 21 project memo that I encourage you to take a look at. And it also comes through, and there have been many efforts in the last, say, 6 months or so. I know an extension, we put together a tool for private forest landowners about climate change and assessing risk on their property. The Minnesota Forest Resources Council just came out with a great report that kind of does a great literature review and summary of all the different aspects of how climate change is going to impact our forests. And so that's really going to help us to really promote research in the space of climate change and forest carbon. I mentioned too, there's been a very widespread effort to let people know about the best ways to plant trees and why it's so good to plant trees. And so many of you maybe have heard of the Trillion Tree Initiative. The US has signed on to that. Many other countries have signed on. That's a great effort that tries to put the focus on planting trees for carbon sequestration. And so lots of folks are doing a lot of great efforts into into that space in terms of trying to plant trees on new areas that maybe are not forested, trying to replant trees where trees previously were. There's a lot of efforts. This idea of kind of showcasing the value of forests and of trees for the carbon value that they have is going to really take center stage when it comes to a lot of these tree planting efforts that are seeing a lot of attention. I'll mention too that I guess I'll say the trees outside forest count too. And so what I mean by that is that traditionally we've always thought of forests as kind of what you might think of as, you know, a large area, say an acre in size, and say having a certain canopy cover that's growing and producing trees. Now there are a lot of other trees that have historically been categorized outside forests, say trees in urban areas, say trees in areas where you transition, say in western Minnesota, from prairie to forests. There are a lot of trees there that we haven't had a good way to monitor and haven't had a good way to quantify, but those trees outside forest count too when it comes to looking at the role that they play in carbon sequestration. I do want to point you to this great paper that came out last year, looking at, you know, if we do plant lots of more trees, where should we plant them? And so this paper by Grant Domke and his colleagues really looks at, what if we took a look at some of these understocked areas? Is there an opportunity there to look at our understocked forest to potentially plant more trees? So that's a great resource to think about more strategically, more tactically, where we might put these efforts into tree planting. The last thing I'll mention is just the importance of new technologies and how they can improve our understanding of forest carbon. And so it used to be, and even still in a lot of the carbon markets, so much of the carbon markets rely on boots on the ground inventory. That is to say, a forester will do a timber cruise to assess how much volume, how much biomass, how much carbon a forest has. But might we be able to use new technology? You know, in Minnesota and other states, we're using things like Landsat time series, like land cover databases, things like aerial imagery, things like LIDAR. How can we best use some of these technologies to improve our understanding of forest carbon, or at least to supplement our understanding? And so as we think about what it means for forest carbon stocks, what it means for how uncertain we are, we need to have a better way of integrating these technologies with how we understand forest carbon and how we ultimately use this information, say, in a forest carbon market. That's going to be a good thing for us to store and sequester carbon. And so just to summarize, I think it's really a great time to be able to talk carbon. And so hopefully, as you've gone through and you've listened to these slides, hopefully it's given you a better sense of how important carbon is in terms of what we do in forestry, and how important it is to understand what we do when we talk about forest carbon. And so with that, I would be happy to take some questions if you have them, Caitlin.
Okay, yeah, we've got lots of great questions. So we've got about 6 minutes before we wrap up. So just so that folks remember, if you have to step out before we're done answering questions, these will all be available in the recording for you. So first is just a comment. Regulatory markets have reserve pools built into the carbon offset estimate or payments to ensure that losses due to insect, disease, or fire can be accounted from the reserve pool rather than a loss to the purchaser. Unregulated markets generally do not require reserve pools. So you can choose to comment or not.
Yeah, no comment for me. Thanks for that clarification from the participant.
Okay. Does your aspen or birch model account for succession to white spruce and increase in spruce growth and increases in deadwood pool, and of course balsam fir in growth as well?
It accounts for succession as long as that succession is represented through the FIA plots that were used to generate that model. And so, yeah, those line graphs that I showed, those models were designed with FIA data. And so I have no doubt that, you know, some of those older aspen stands are transitioning to more mixed species, especially spruce. And so, yeah, I think there is some of that going on in terms of you're capturing some of that growth from additional species. Yeah, so it wasn't just the aspen species in that aspen and birch forest type, but it was all species. So yeah, it would represent all species.
Great. Have good formulas been developed to relate AGB to BGB?
Yeah, so the relationship between above ground biomass and below ground biomass, the issue with that is it's really tough to measure and to weigh roots. And so a lot of studies have tried it, often dealing with trees of limited sample size, trees, especially those larger size trees, they just can't measure the roots. And so typically, I mean, the good rule of thumb is if you know what the above ground portion weighs, the below ground portion is about 20% of that. And so that's about the extent of kind of the relationship. It's a good rule of thumb. Weighing roots and good studies on biomass of roots is just really difficult to get.
Great. Okay. Can you walk us through a fully worked example from volume per acre to CO2 per acre, including below ground carbon and deadwood, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I would do, so typically start with the forest inventory of the trees. And so if you have the inventory of the trees, say in cords per acre or in board feet per acre, you could use an equation to predict, you need to know, you need to have a model to predict how much cords or how much carbon is in those. And so you could do that like how I described on the slide. The thing about kind of looking at, how do you go from the trees to all the other carbon pools? And for that, typically what's done in the FIA approach is just to kind of do it on a proportional basis. And so if you look at that graph of the carbon pools and how they're distributed, in soil, mineral soil, organic soil, deadwood, litter, you can just take proportions of that above ground carbon that you have a calculated value for and kind of distribute them depending on their proportion. So that would kind of be the best kind of back of the envelope way to do it. For other ways, there are lots of other models. The Forest Vegetation Simulator has a carbon component to it. And so you could also use a growth model to estimate how much carbon are across all those different pools.
Great. Okay, we've got 3 more questions here. Within Minnesota particularly, how do forests compare to prairie systems in amount of carbon sequestered? How about the amount of carbon stored?
That's a great question. I mean, certainly our forests above ground store much more carbon than some of those other systems, but don't discount what prairies can store in terms of carbon, especially below ground. Many of those systems and those plants, you can see a grass that's 2 or 3 feet high, but by gosh, there's 10, 20 feet of roots beneath it. And so, yes, in general, definitely our forests are excellent storage and sequestering opportunities when we think about other landscapes across Minnesota, but the other, prairies, grasslands contribute too, certainly not as much as forests do.
Okay. You mentioned harvested wood. How does carbon sequestered in harvested wood get accounted for? What about harvesting or processing related emissions?
It's a good question. Harvested wood is a really interesting one, particularly as there's so much more interest now in things like mass timber buildings, even things like as we talk about the circular economy, when we try to have kind of zero waste from everything that we utilize, and so it's an important one. So if you look at the data, when we look at that, forests sequester about 14% of all the CO2. In harvested wood products, that harvested wood products number is about 5%. And so harvested wood products do a great job. And I think, as much as we can continue to persuade people to build with wood instead of steel, that number I think is just going to be increasing. And so it's important to think about, if it's going to be in something like a building, well, that has a longer shelf life than say if it's going to be a piece of paper. And so that's the main thing, is just kind of designating what the end products are of that wood coming from something, and whether it's in paper or it's in a building or it's in some other thing, that's really the key thing to think about with harvested wood products.
All right. With the climate changing, should our selection of species to plant change if considering the long view?
It's a good question. Yeah, we've been talking about that a lot in terms of in our extension programs, but what we're telling landowners. And so I think definitely the eye toward thinking about what the future is going to look like 40, 80, 100 years from now is just really important. And so there are great tools. The Climate Change Tree Atlas is just a fantastic tool to think about. Okay, I'm thinking about planting this tree. What's the future range of that? I would really urge you to take a look at that and see what it looks like for a species that you're thinking of. And we always encourage a diversity of species. And so, thinking about different species that maybe do well or maybe are, as long as you don't plant your entire property with some species that's found in southern Minnesota and you're in northern Minnesota, I think you need to think about diversity when you come to planting. Think about the Climate Change Tree Atlas for being a tool you can use to select, which tree species you might be interested in planting.
All right, great. Well, there was a question earlier about mineral soil and why it holds more carbon than organic soil that you had answered. And there's still some uncertainty about why mineral soils hold more carbon than organic. If mineral soils have less plant material than organic soils, you would think that organic soils would hold more carbon than mineral soils. Or am I missing something?
It's a good point. I need to go back and look at the FIA definition and how they separate those two out. Because I think that's the question came from that graph that showed mineral soil being such a much larger contributor than organic soil. So I just need to go back to the FIA data and see how they calculate that.
Okay, great. Yeah, the participant that had that question actually emailed. So Matt, I can forward that to you. Maybe include some resources on the event page with the recording later on. It looks like we've got one more thing in the chat. There has been evidence that more diverse ecosystems are better at maintaining productivity, which equals consistent sequestration, just based on area. I guess is the question is that just based on area?
Yeah, so in general, yeah, there have been studies that have shown that more diverse ecosystems or more diverse forests are more productive. And so a lot of work has been done in that area. Well, the idea is that, different species are able to grab and utilize the resources differently. And so if you have lots of different species, you can theoretically sequester more. And so, yeah, I'm not sure what looking at by area means, but one of the things we encourage is that if you're interested in managing for both carbon storage and sequestration, is to manage mixed species uneven age stands. And so you're kind of getting the best of both worlds in that you've got lots of different species to capture all the differences in the species and how they grow in terms of nutrients and water availability that they need. And then you're getting all the storage of some of the older age classes that are a part of that system. And so not only mixed species, but uneven age stands would be great to store and sequester carbon.
Great. So there's still just some interest on which publications to refer to for equations so that they can start calculating carbon for the forests folks work with. So if you prefer, I could get those from you and include them on the event page later for folks to access, unless there's something you have off the top of your head now, but I'm sure there'll be some things that will be easier to look up afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. In the slide deck, I don't know if there's a link to it, but what we call the Jenkins equations are the best for how much biomass, how much carbon is in a tree. And then from there, it's really kind of scaling up. And yeah, there are lots of resources, not always kind of publicly available. Most of those are journal articles that are behind paywalls, unfortunately. But yeah, we can find a way to get those to folks.
Perfect. Okay, then with that, I'll go ahead and wrap it up. I don't see any additional questions at this point. So I just want to say thank you, Matt. That was a great start to the year. And thank you to all of you who attended and stuck around for all the questions. And we'll see you next month, hopefully.